Legends and canon take different approaches to the story of clones being phased out and replaced by stormtroopers. In Legends, the process was gradual. Fate clones were first mixed with clones of other lineages and then slowly but incompletely phased out. As we recently saw in the Bad Batch, things went much differently in canon. The Empire was immediately interested in phasing out clones and soon got to work on the TK Trooper project, training a test batch of stormtrooper recruits just a few months after the declaration of a new order. But there's one constant between the two stories. The new guys were trained by the clones. In Legends, clones like Commander Cody stayed on as training instructors for the new recruits, while in canon, the job fell to clone Commandos. But why did the clones train their own replacements? Why would they render themselves obsolete? In this video, we'll be exploring that question.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Quick disclaimer, the topic of this video is canon, so we won't be talking about Cody or Stormtrooper training in Legends. A lot of what we'll talk about later in the video would be relevant to Legends' story as well, however. Now on to the topic at hand. First and foremost, we meant it when we said in the title that Clone Commandos chose to participate in Stormtrooper training. This isn't because they could have just retired or something, well, not legally anyway. In canon, the Empire didn't exactly let clones choose what they were going to do with their lives. They were, after all, fully owned slaves of the state. However, there's a difference between doing a job and doing it well. If the Commandos assigned to train TK troopers didn't want to do their job, they wouldn't have acted with the enthusiasm and aggression we saw in the Bad Batch. The presence of clone Commandos on Wayland at the end of the season reinforces this point. The Empire placed some serious trust in these clone Commandos despite their deep distrust of all other clones, so much so that they assigned them to guard the most sensitive installations and train a new secret army. This suggests that the Empire had reason to believe most of the Commandos were deeply loyal. If you're at all familiar with how clone Commandos are usually characterized, that should seem odd. After all, Commandos were generally some of the most rebellious clones. So what's different here? And because we'll know what'll come up, no, the answer isn't inhibitor chips. Think back to the case of Captain Hauser and his men. The inhibitor chips were powerful influences, not personality erasers, and post-Order 66 clones weren't mindless drones incapable of disobeying orders. Regular clones were absolutely capable of abandoning the duties the Empire had given them. And if the Regs could do it, the Commandos sure as hell could too. Whatever reason the Commandos had for training the TK troopers, it was their choice. The strangest thing about the whole affair is that the Commandos absolutely knew what they were doing. It was blatantly obvious that the TK troopers were meant to replace clones, and no Commando was dumb enough to think they wouldn't eventually be replaced as well. These Commandos were actively shooting themselves in the foot by training the TK troopers. They were essentially digging their own graves. It's more than that actually, they were training their future executioners to kill. Clone Commandos, generally speaking, were a bit brighter than the average Reg. On top of that, they were experienced. They had participated in and learned from 3 years of galactic warfare. Oftentimes, these Commandos would have seen the worst of the war. They would have seen the Republic and Confederacy betray their allies when it became strategically unviable. They may well have participated in such betrayals. They would have been all too familiar with betrayal, and they would have known how willing the Empire would be to stab them in the back after they finished up training the TKs. Furthermore, these Commandos would have been capable of cutting and running like Gregor did. Sure, Gregor was captured and needed help escaping in the end, but the Clone Commandos were resourceful. The likes of Scorch probably would have been able to escape, especially if they weren't alone. They could have retired on their own terms. It would have been dangerous, but hey, these were Commandos. Their whole lives were dangerous. If anyone could successfully break away from the Empire, it would have been them. But we only know of one Commando in canon that did break away from the Empire successfully. The other clones that did were all Regs. The only logical explanation is that these clone Commandos genuinely believed in the TK Trooper project, or at least in the Empire, enough that they would willingly act against their own interests. That wouldn't be out of place for the Bad Batch either. After all, Crosshair did the same after his inhibitor chip was removed. Clearly, Crosshair wasn't the only Commando with genuine loyalty to the Empire. As you may recall from an earlier video we did on the topic, Crosshair was likely loyal to the Empire because it gave him purpose. He was created as a soldier, bred for the express purpose of fighting for the Republic. Crosshair and most other clones didn't seem to care much about the politics of either the Republic or the Empire. To them, the two governments were abstract concepts that represented their only purpose in life. Crosshair continued to serve the Empire because not serving the Empire would have stripped him of his purpose, and the thought of that would be terrifying for anyone. It's not much of a stretch to say that many clone commandos felt similarly. Clone commandos saw a particularly nasty side of the Clone Wars. Most lost at least one of their pod brothers on dangerous missions, some lost their entire squads. They went through hell on covert missions for the Republic, and many of those who went on to train TK troopers probably did so because they didn't want it all to be for nothing. Though they didn't know it until after the war's end, all of their sacrifices during the Clone Wars had been made for the sake of building the Empire. To these clones, that meant the Empire had to be worthwhile, or else it was all for nothing. The intended purpose of clone commandos didn't change after Order 66. They were still meant to covertly build the Empire. It's just that what that meant shifted from carrying out covert missions to training TK troopers. It's possible, and perhaps probable, that the commandos were willfully ignorant that the TK troopers would replace them. The commandos probably saw their jobs less as training replacements and more like strengthening the Empire, the same thing they'd always done. Hell, some of them probably didn't care much that they'd get shot at the end of it all. They'd always been told that their job was to die for someone else's cause, after all. Of course, there's also a more sinister possibility. If you're familiar with the Legends character Alpha 17, you probably know that there's precedent of clone characters genuinely believing in the principles the Empire would later come to represent. Many clones genuinely believed that the people of the galaxy needed all-powerful leaders to tell them what to do. After all, that was how their lives had always been structured. Others would have become jaded by the Clone Wars, convinced that the people of the galaxy just couldn't be trusted with their own lives. Either way, we don't think the Commandos were too concerned about the end result of their training of the TK troopers. All that would have mattered to them, we suspect, is that they were doing their jobs. Consequences be damned. That was always how it had been. They'd always been expected to risk their lives and the lives of their brothers to get the job done. So long as it gave them purpose in life, the details didn't matter much. So that's our theory about why clone commandos stayed on to train TK troopers after the end of the Clone Wars. But what do you think? Do you have your own theories? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. As always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.